Alright, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast. BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Well, we are in the heart and soul of October. It's a beautiful day outside, and we are approaching Halloween, but today is October 24th, and this is the anniversary of the disappearance of Joan Risch, going all the way back to 1961. I am so bad at math, by the way. I was thinking that this was the 68th year that Joan Risch had disappeared, but I guess from 61 to 2018, the time of this recording, it's actually only, I guess, 57 years or something like that. I'm bad at math. I'm just bad at that, absolutely. So you'll have to excuse me for any time on this channel when I can't calculate any of the dates and stuff. Yeah, I'm just a little bit slow in that department. But let's talk about Joan Risch. Around this time last year, I was, following Joan Risch rather closely. This was one of the true crime cases that really stood out to me. And I think some of the reasons for that are, it was one of the first that I ever got to discuss with somebody. I found out about the disappearance of Joan Risch because of Wikipedia. I'm not exactly sure which case I was reading about. It might have even been Maura Murray, but I'm not sure. I was reading about the disappearance of somebody, and Wikipedia suggested a related subject, the disappearance of Joan Risch. So I read the Wikipedia page, and I've been hooked ever since. When I was first getting into it, I was, going over the information, and I was discussing this with somebody. Like, it's one of the few times when I sat down, with a person, and we could have actually gone back and forth over the information and tried to come to somewhat of a conclusion together. And both of us were just going over the information about Joan Risch. And she was, we just both came to the same conclusion after about 24 hours that miscarriage or abortion. Before I had ever heard any YouTuber ever discuss those possibilities, before I had read any blogs that discussed those possibilities, that's what, my friend and I were zoning in on. We were both just like, all the signs were pointing to abortion, because obviously abortion was illegal at the time. This was years before Roe v. Wade in America. And, it's just like, it was just, kind of like what you would say, the second instinct. Now, we're not going over too much background information because this is for people who are somewhat familiar with the case, like most uploads on this channel, so we can discuss theories. I mean, the big thing to say is that there's been this very large dichotomy in the Joan Risch case where they were trying to figure out, was Joan actually suffering a real horrible tragedy, whether it was an abortion, a murder, or some sort of brutality, or was this a completely staged disappearance? And, the reason for that is, they found that, they found the books that Joan read at the library. She read numerous books about, not only mysteries, but also about, staging a disappearance. One of them had a very, very similar scene in, I believe that was the book Into Thin Air, which has a very similar scene about staging a disappearance to, so you can get away, and even just leaving blood and trying to clean up, and all of those details are in the book. But I would say, though, my absolute first instinct was that this was a staged disappearance, that this was not a genuine atrocity. I mean, literally, first instinct, when I read that Wikipedia page, I was just like, this is staged. That's what this is. Because, those are odd similarities, but there's another perspective to that. You could just say, she liked mysteries. She liked crime novels. She liked crime stories. I mean, a lot of us, if we were to ever go missing, and there was blood on our floor, I don't know, would somebody say that about you? They definitely would about me if they were to even just go through some of these uploads. Even just talking about Joan Risch would probably, throw you into the same category, and people might be questioning it. So, 24 hours after, going through the information, discussing this with a friend back and forth, we were both like, this really sounds like there was either some sort of miscarriage or there was an abortion that was going on. I mean, this is still a mystery, but I would say that I went back and forth between the two possibilities over my initial span, and it's like when I was first making uploads for this channel discussing Joan Risch, I really narrowed in, or should I just say, I centered on the possibility that it was a staged disappearance. I decided to go back to my gut instinct. One of the things that I would say that supported Joan Risch being a staged disappearance was that every avenue you explore, any idea that you put forward, any theory that you come up with, in the case of Joan Risch, just leads to a giant roadblock. And it's like people are even saying that in the comment sections on these podcast uploads. They're like, everything in Joan Risch just leads to more questions. No matter what you do, it's like, if you are going to say that it's an abortion that went wrong and then some abortionist got Joan out of the house and tried to, maybe even murdered her, and, well, where's the body, huh, after all this time? Also, where is the physical evidence that, the abortion doctor did what he said he did? Moreover, we have the very peculiar blood evidence. Everything about this case is peculiar. If you're going to say that this is a staged disappearance, once again, where's the physical evidence to support that? I mean, it's like all of the physical details in this case do not seem to be super representative of any particular theory. And I still even say that to this day. It's been definitely well over a year and a half since I've been, exploring Joan Risch and trying to go back and forth about some possibilities. I still say that the physical evidence isn't necessarily leaning toward one particular theory. So my conclusion was, last autumn around this time, my conclusion was that was because someone was intentionally manipulating the information. Someone was intentionally trying to distort things so people couldn't make sense of it. That is why I believe in my upload on Joan Risch conclusion, I stated that I now think this is a staged disappearance. Everything about the house, the phone is pulled out of the wall, but the book is open to emergency numbers. I mean, very peculiar things. You'd think if there was an abortion that happened in the house, the phone is open to emergency numbers and you had a doctor right there. I mean, that could even set off some flags. Or you could just be like, this was a miscarriage and Joan didn't know she was pregnant, and maybe that she just got frustrated because she wasn't able to focus, so she pulled the phone out of the wall and placed it in the wastebasket. But once again, all of those things sound so speculative and flimsy when I drop them off right now. So I was just like, this was a staged disappearance. Well, let's just say, a lot can change in 12 months. A lot can change going over information, again and again. And, after a few months after my initial series of uploads on Joan Risch, I began discussing this case with someone named Carla Barbosa here in the comment sections on these uploads here on BBOR. And Carla's left some comments on other cases too. Very, very helpful things. And she's been an excellent researcher about the case of Joan Risch. And I'd really have to say, though, I had another reversal. This is one where I just can't stay consistent to any single theory. And a big thing, though, that I just need to say about, because I've talked about a lot of the theories on the other uploads, is if someone was distorting the information, why does it have to be Joan? It doesn't. I mean, wouldn't that just mean that there was someone else in the house that was trying to clean up, and then they were just like, forget it, and then they're just like getting the heck out of there? I mean, that would explain the distorted blood evidence. I mean, I really do focus in on that. The investigators cannot exactly make sense of it. Very peculiar places to find, the drops of blood here and there, and trying to clean up the floor with a pair of the baby's overalls. Very peculiar blood evidence. But who's to say that that was Joan? Moreover, I mean, Carla brought up the point that it could have even been Joan's daughter. She would have had 30 minutes in the house by herself when she could have done any sort of thing to, move any sort of objects, to move any of the things that could have affected the crime scene, even possibly coming into contact with blood, and the blood transferred somehow to the baby's bedroom, to the blood that was near the car, all of those things. Who's to say that it was Joan that distorted the blood evidence or distorted anything in the crime scene? And even if we look past the daughter Lillian, it could just be that there was a man in the house who did something wrong to Joan, whether it's an abortionist or whether it's just an individual for some other reason. And then, that's what led to the disappearance. That person, tried to stabilize the scene first they try to clean up, then they're just like, no. And then they just get out of there. It's very possible that it actually is something associated with that. But I cannot get away from this gut-wrenching feeling that the reason why a lot of the physical evidence in the case of Joan Risch does not make perfect sense is because someone has distorted it. I think I made the assumption too early on that this would have had to have been Joan. That, I still get these kind of feelings about the crime scene that it is somewhat of it seems very, very staged. And it's like, there are just some things about it that I think are rather odd. Carla and I were discussing something about the beer bottles that were allegedly found at the on the Risch residence, and the very famous line that is even on the Wikipedia page, not to mention in countless other blogs and forums and most major public sources, I should say, about the disappearance of Joan Risch, is that there was a liquor bottle in the trash that Martin Risch, her husband, could account for, but he wasn't able to identify beer bottles that were found in the house. But after, Carla and I were discussing that, and she brought to my attention that Martin did know where the beer bottles were from. It's just they were not from the previous night. They were from several nights prior. And that really answered a lot of things, because I was really zoning in on that particular aspect where I thought that Joan was hiding something. I thought that was a very telling clue. That either, she got herself intoxicated so she could make sort of an incision into her body, and that she had staged the scene so her, she injured herself so she could produce the blood evidence, and she wanted to be somewhat intoxicated so she wouldn't feel it. Secondarily, the other possibility with that is Joan had a man in her house that she didn't want her husband to know about, and they were drinking beer together, and then something terrible happened, hence the horrific scene and the nature of what we have going on in the home. And both of those things could be possible, but I think it makes a lot more sense, and it really gets rid of a lot of the scandalous aspects of the case by looking at it from the perspective that Martin Risch was aware of the beer bottles that were found, and I believe the interpretation of that statement is probably something like, he said that they drank a bottle of liquor the night before, but they did not drink the beer the night before, and they came from a night that was even earlier in the week than that. Once again, that's just, a particular feeling, but, well, what happened to Joan? I'd say that right now, I'm still leaning to somebody has really tampered with the crime scene. I'm pretty sure that Joan passed away very soon after this incident. Martin Risch talked about how there could be the possibility of amnesia, that she had a very serious case of amnesia, and that she was just completely forgot everything. And people are sometimes in that position. Sometimes they are in that position. We're all familiar with the case of Benjamin Kyle, who he had a very strong case of amnesia late in his life, and he forgot nearly his whole past except for his name, Benjamin. However, though, I really don't know if that's necessarily the case, and I explored that theory somewhat on this channel, but I do think that Joan passed away shortly after this. Because it's like, I'm just not seeing a lot of physical evidence to support the theory that Joan survived much longer. And we also have there are no records of anyone turning up in any hospitals in the area that, would have matched her description. And, if they have a bleeding woman in a hospital who can't remember who she is, well, then, sooner or later, the police would be able to work something like that out. But none of that happened. We also have the bloody sightings of Joan Risch on the highway. If I understand the description, she was walking down the median of the highway, like not the sidewalk or the shoulder, but the median. But once again, I do have to insist with those things. Those sightings are not definitive. We don't necessarily know 100% that was Joan. And, they sound pretty gory. It's like, one of the first instincts that everybody has when it comes to the bloody sightings of Joan Risch is that, someone says even that, they saw a woman that possibly could have had blood running down their legs, and they didn't stop to help. Well, that's not uncommon, actually. And that's a bad thing. That's bad, but that's not uncommon. I was actually just looking into the case of Cynthia Jaramillo, who is, I was thinking about doing an upload for the channel about her, where she is someone who escaped, a torture chamber. She was being held by a sadist, and she escaped from this torture chamber wearing only a chain around her neck. She's 100% naked, and she has a metal chain around her neck, and she ran over to someone's car for help, and the person was just like, no, and drove away. A lot of people have that kind of gut instinct to just get away from somebody like that, which isn't good. That's bad. If someone is coming after you for help, or you see somebody covered in blood, you probably should do something about it. But I've definitely noticed that in the comments sections. That seems to be one of the largest things to say about any of the bloody sightings of Joan Risch. But I do have to insist, those are not definitive. Is this just one of the most common theories out there? Did Joan Risch just wander off in a disoriented state and fall into a construction pit? Well, if that's the case, how does that tie back to an abortionist? Was there an abortionist who tried to get her out of the house and then just dropped her somewhere in the middle of nowhere? How are those two things connected? We also have the possibility of the so-called mystery car that was apparently in the Risch driveway at some time earlier before the police say they showed up. The police insist that the witnesses just got their timeline wrong, and the car that they're talking about was actually just an unmarked police car that was there about an hour and a half later. But the witnesses insist that that's not the case, and I don't think the police followed up on that lead very closely, if I understand. If I understand the motivation that they are... If the motivation for the police to make those comments, there's definitely some confusion over that detail. The next thing to say is, if Joan died in a construction pit, no one saw Joan leave the house, no bloody footprints. That's one of the biggest things I still wonder about today. You think if someone was, was really bleeding, no bloody footprints at all. Granted, if there had been one, someone might have been able to distort the crime scene again. A lot of the blood evidence was interfered with. We even have the bloody pair of overalls on the floor. But, does that suggest more that this was, just indeed a hemorrhage? I guess I'm leaning down that road now. That, it's like, some sort of abortion or hemorrhage, and maybe that wouldn't necessarily produce these types of, bloody footprints on the floor, because I don't necessarily know on that. Excuse me for jumbling my words there for a second, but we also have the possibility that, once again, the daughter, Lillian, was in the house. She could have, covered up some of the blood evidence or interfered with it or done something to the crime scene. It's a very odd kind of peculiarity about the crime scene, that there were not any footprints. And, there is the possibility, though, and I think they do even state this on the initial Wikipedia page, that the reason for no bloody footprints is that the perpetrator, or Joan, was either very lucky or very careful. Maybe, it's just by chance that it happened this way. Now, I was trying to say something that I just didn't want it to come out the wrong way. I wanted to say that there was the possibility that Joan was having a miscarriage. And, she suffered the hemorrhage, and blood's just starting to run down her legs, and there wouldn't necessarily be that much blood evidence on the floor initially. So, if it's running down her legs, there's just going to be a smaller amount of area of blood that's on the floor for her to step in, if you can understand what I'm saying. Even as I say that now, it might be a little confusing to understand. But, this isn't something that's going to be like an open wound that is going to be gushing out or something like that. I gotta move on from that point. I think you can get the idea, but that's not really something that we need to focus in on too much. Other big things that we should talk about. If there was, an abortionist in the house, no sightings of that person. We do have sightings of a strange man who was also seen, driving a similar car that might match the description of the mystery car. A similar individual who was seen cutting branches off of a tree. And one of the YouTubers out there discussed this case with her father, and the father suggested that he was cutting the branches off the tree, so he was going to take Joan's body somewhere and burn it and set it on fire. And my first instinct with that was like, absolutely not. And then, it's like, as you keep an open mind and you keep just sort of the possibilities open, then it's sort of like, well, maybe that's somewhere in the scope of possibilities, that some man got Joan's body out of the house, and then that's what happened to Joan. And that's why there is no more, that's why that Joan was never seen again. That's why Joan never came back. That's a big thing we do need to say, though. No contact. Absolutely none. Zero. Zilch. Nada. I just don't know. I mean, I don't really know the thought process that would go into somebody like that. Leaving your daughter and your son. She had 2 children. Would she really, abandon her family like that? Not even send some sort of, no mysterious Christmas cards that came 5 years later. Absolutely no contact of any kind. And, that's a very big thing to point out. That is one of the big things why I suggest that I believe that Joan is no longer living, or that she died very shortly after her disappearance. Did she fall in a construction pit? It's possible, but once again, we haven't seen the physical evidence to support that. Was she murdered and then some guy set her body on fire somewhere off in the middle of nowhere? Once again, we don't have the exact physical evidence to support it, but there is that possibility. Another thing that, people have talked about is just that, the amnesia theory that was put forward by Martin Risch, that, Joan didn't turn up in any hospitals nearby, but someone could have taken her somewhere and, she just carried on her life under a different name. That one is a little bit more implausible. I really do have to insist that I believe that Joan passed away very shortly after this tragic incident. Furthermore, what about the stories of the neighbors who saw Joan carrying something red, walking with outstretched arms? My initial theory about that one was that Joan was just carrying beer out of the car, that she was carrying the beer bottles, but once again, we've talked about that. That issue was kind of sorted out. A lot of people interpret Joan walking from the car to her home, outstretched arms, carrying something red. They think that Joan had blood on her hands already at that point. Is that true? I I'm not necessarily sure. One of the big things that I noticed, I don't think anyone reported anything like red packages. I mean, I don't recall anyone ever discussing something like a red box that was found nearby, a red anything, really. Another reason why I thought it was the beer bottles, I mean, you can imagine something like Budweiser has a red, label, or something like Red Stripe. Beers are frequently use the color red, but that one's pretty much been sorted. That was just kind of an idea that I had in the past. All right, well, this one is coming to the end. This is really just the anniversary of the disappearance of Joan Risch, so I just wanted to sort of go over kind of everything that I had been dealing with over the last year and a half since I was really investigating the case of Joan Risch. Very jumbled, very far out, and I mangled a few words in there, so you'll have to excuse me for that. But I would say that it's been very good to discuss this on this channel, and once again, thank you to Carla, but thank you also to everyone else who has commented. I really think that we've had some kind of good discussions, and I've done a Joan Risch True Crime Q&A where, I really got the chance to read off a lot of very interesting comments. I mean, someone has pointed out to me that one of the theories I had entertained was that beer was used in the homemade abortion, but someone was kind of, just giving me a little bit of education on that. We also had a theory that was coming from someone named Looking Glass Mimsy, who said that she believed that the blood came from Joan's mouth after a complication from the dentist visit. I mean, I can't endorse that theory. I just thought that was a very, very kind of almost creative response. So it's people shared a lot of very interesting, insightful, and thoughtful comments in this case, and thank you to everybody who's left a comment, and thank you again if you have made it to the end of this very, very lengthy, drawn-out recording. Thank you.